All right, what's up, guys? We are back with another podcast episode, and today we have a guest that will hopefully help answer and eliminate many of the questions we've had on paddle testing in pickleball. Today we have Carl Schmitz from USAP, who is the Managing Director of Equipment Standards. It's nice to finally have you here, Carl. We've been trying to set this up for a little bit, and we finally managed to make it work.
Yeah, good morning, Chris. Good morning, Will. Thanks for having me on.
But the first thing I'd like to go over, just for people who aren't familiar with you, can you just kind of give us your background at USAP and what you're currently working on as far as paddles go?
Sure. I've been involved with USA Pickleball since 2015, initially as a local ambassador. I'm starting up a club and working with the city to develop a facility, a permanent facility. In 2016, I became involved with the Equipment Evaluation Committee, which just started up at that point, led by a chief engineer at the time, working on in the aerospace industry, primarily supporting Boeing as a customer. He essentially drove the creation of most of the standards and testing protocols that we're using today, and remains on the EEC. Since then, I've become increasingly involved in different programs with USAP, working into more of a contract role, moving from a volunteer into a contract role in 2020. And then over time, the scope of the projects I've been involved with have increased substantially.
Sure. So what does an average day look like for you especially this year? I'm sure it's been absolutely crazy for you. Just kind of walk us through a day.
Sure. So I have a couple of functions within USAP. One of them, of course, is equipment standards. I also do facilities development. Generally, what I'll do from about 6 a.m. until 10 or so is I have video conference calls with either clients on the facility side or working with new manufacturers that have just come on board. So we walk them through the specifications and tests and sampling requirements. So it's an onboarding process. We like to give them as much data and support right out of the gate. And then there'll be ad hoc discussions with engineering teams, whether we're addressing the issues from the previous weekend or talking about what's next. And so we have a confidential relationship with these manufacturers. If they want to share a new design with us that might push the boundaries or address a white space between the rules, they talk to us first. They share the designs with us, again, in confidence, and we'll give them either an immediate or a reviewed feedback later on, whether or not we consider it within the existing rules.
Sure. So is it kind of like a 9 to 5 then?
Well, yeah. So after the morning's calls, usually what I'll do is we're just building out a compliance lab here in the Northwest, which includes the complete library of certified paddles. So all 2,000 plus paddles that have been certified over the last several years. We use those. We'll pluck one if we've sourced a paddle from the market to test for compliance, make sure that its specifications are the same as that when they were initially certified. But we're also we're really excited about a few new things that we're working on. One of them is a focus on acoustics. It's been a big issue in the market. Some feel it's a barrier to growth. And so we're in the process of launching a couple of programs where we'll measure paddles' acoustic specifications when they land. There's no upper limit or anything, but we do want to characterize what their acoustic profile looks like. And then we will be launching an incentive program to help drive or motivate manufacturers to make quieter paddles as well, and balls, which will ideally ease things going into the future when it comes to a city council meeting where people have to talk about the type of equipment that's being used out there.
So will that become a public data sheet that people can kind of see? I don't know exactly how you'll measure, if it's just in decibels. I'm sure it's a number of things, but will that be public for people to kind of look at?
Well, what we'll do, we'll share it with an entity that we're working closely with. That's Pickleball Sound Mitigation. He's got quite Bob Unitic and his team have quite an online presence already. He's built a business. He's got some real talented people on staff as well that come from the industry, and they're going to be publishing basically a list. I think he's calling it a blue list because it's a bit evolved from the green list. And this will contain paddles that are below, let's say, 1,000 hertz in terms of sound pressure. In terms of the where it falls in the acoustic profile or spectrum, and then below, it's below about 85 in terms of sound pressure, so in decibels.
Sure.
Wow. So, Carl, it sounds like you have a lot of things going on just from what you're telling us right now. I'm curious because you said that you provide support to manufacturers. How often are you speaking with the manufacturers, and how large is your team, and is it growing? Because I'd imagine with 2,000 plus paddles, with more companies coming onto the market, they're inundating you with just questions, paddles, reviews, and how do you handle all that?
Sure. So the Equipment Evaluation Committee actually consists of 3 members, but there's also a support staff. And then we're also bringing on some additional headcount to address this spike in manufacturers and new incoming paddles as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have, I guess, a rough number of like what your overall team is looking at now, numbers wise, and maybe what you plan to have in the future.
Sure. Yeah. It's not rough. We've got a pretty good forecast right now. It's based on, a look back in terms of what the run rates have been, and then what we expect this year, again, measured against the run rate through Q1. We'll probably be north of 650 new product introductions this year. These are new paddles and balls. We expect somewhere between 250 to 300 new brands to come on board as well this year. Clearly, we're working with some of the largest brands in sports, with Head, with Babolat. There's many of them that are established in multiple racket sports and other sporting goods as well. But there's a lot of very talented, very creative entities coming on board as well that think they may have a better mousetrap, and so we'll review their designs during this onboarding process. And that piece is manageable. It is the acquisition of paddles for compliance testing, which we're really trying to dial the knob on, because there's so many new paddles that fall within this ultra rough state, north of 38 RT. So we're keeping a very close eye on them. We anticipate probably between 130 and 150 paddles to have that configuration this year introduced. So that on top of what's already been introduced in the previous years means that we've really got to dial it up on the market sampling side and the compliance testing and screening side. So that's one of the functions of this local compliance lab. We'll be running it through screening to begin with. If the paddle fails a surface roughness test there, or dimensioning, for example, then we'll send it into the labs for an official test.
I see. So this lab that you're building right now, it's not meant to replace NTS. It's kind of just like an ingest and then off to NTS.
And research as well. We're doing some additional research there. Parallel to what NTS is doing, we've acquired an optical scanner, which we'll talk about a little bit later when they get into testing. So we'll be doing some corollary scanning of paddles, or corollary testing of existing paddles that had passed previously, and compare that data with what NTS comes up with as well. And then, as I mentioned before, on ingestion, we'll also have an anechoic chamber where we'll be able to test the paddle's acoustic profile here, every paddle as they come in.
Sure. Can you kind of walk us through how some of the standards were developed for pickleball? Because I think some of the questions people have had is just like, how did we land on the numbers we did, specifically like deflection and RZ and RT?
Sure. Some of them were evolutionary, and just from a historic standpoint, back in 2015, when our chief engineer started this transition process, he used a term called crawl, walk, run. There's no way that we could go from testing in a garage back in the 2010 to 2014 period directly into a lab. We needed to transition existing tests and standards and parameters into a more controlled environment, conducted by sports engineers that were well prepared from training standpoint. Since then, what we've done is evolved several of the specifications or migrated platforms as well. And some examples here that I look back on, and I'm quite proud of what we've done over the last 6 years or so. Besides that initial transition to the labs to NTS back in 15, in the last 3 years alone, we've introduced upgraded test platforms. For example, the Instron tensile tester that we use for multiple tests today. The compression test for balls. This was an evolution of what we had used as just a hardness test. Now we're using an industry standard in the sports industry compression test. We brought in the coefficient of friction. This was back, and we started research on this in 2019 and launched it in 2020. This was a way of understanding basically the interaction between ball and paddle as affected by coatings, which may feel smooth to the touch. So the old roughness test, which we all use, we see referees use, and of course we know is related to the Starrett surface roughness test. In this case, coatings could be applied and also increase the friction between ball and paddle. So we introduced a fairly sophisticated test from that again. It's based on the industry standard. And then this quarter, we'll be transitioning from this traditional SR160, uses a stylus profiler. We'll be transitioning from that to an optical profiler, which uses white light interferometry and green light interferometry to map thousands of data points on the paddle face, which we can then analyze for surface roughness using a variety of ASME and ISO specs. We'll work on that transition this quarter once we've accumulated enough data, raw data, and we'll start to look at just one of those ASME and ISO standards we'll want to use for this transition. The one thing I want to reiterate is that this isn't a plan to out or orphan any existing paddle manufacturer. We'll use existing samples that did pass the test at NTS to establish this basis of data, and then we'll work from those. We won't use market samples because of concerns for QC and things like that, which we'll talk about in the compliance function later. But what we'll use will be paddles that have passed through the eye of the needle, in the certification test to form the basis of our data.
So you talked about industry standards, and kind of that's what these tests were based off of. Are they from other sports that are similar? So I'm specifically thinking the roughness values that we've allowed with the Starrett. Is there something we pulled 30 and 40 from and applied it to pickleball that was similar, or did we just kind of think these are the numbers that seem like a good idea?
Yeah, there was no other sports corollary for those numbers. Where we landed on 40 and 50, frankly, was driven by the state of the art at the time. Back in the 15, 16 time frame, there was, it's out of reach right here, but typically we saw peel ply paddles, fiberglass face, generally with dye sub type graphics or some other type of applied graphics. The Starrett test and the 40 and 30 parameters were derived from upper limits and testing a number of paddles and looking really for pretty significant irregularities in the paddle surface. Of course, we all know when the Electrum was introduced, the Electrum Pro was introduced at the end of 2018, that introduced an engineered surface, which is very different than the kind of the irregular results of the peel ply that we saw up to date. That presented a challenge for us in that it was the first fully engineered surface of its type. It was, though, engineered to fall within the 40 and 30 RT and RZ thresholds, and it did pass, and was fairly consistent over the years in that. But, that said, it was the only paddle of its kind until, I think, 2021. Then we started to see, less than a handful of paddles introduced that year that had a similar surface, but it really started to ramp in 22. And of course, this year, the numbers I shared earlier really have driven us to reevaluate how we're measuring it. So using the optical scanner, and then what we will be measuring. It won't just be a peak to valley. It might be looking at the overall increase of contact area created by this new texture, for a texture. So it's a fairly sophisticated approach that we're able to take to really understand the contact mechanics between ball and paddle surface.
Yeah. At what point did the Starrett start feeling like, okay, maybe this isn't the right tool? I think there was, obviously we kind of had the Carbon Gate last year, and I think that kind of brought up some concerns about the Starrett and, maybe just the industry as a whole with grit. Was there a specific point where it was like, okay, we need to go find a better tool than what we're using now?
Yeah, very much so. It was in Q1 last year. There were a number of new introductions at the time that had, fairly significant volumes behind them. And so we knew that the market, he was going to see a lot of these paddles. It was at that time that both our internal chief engineer as well as input from a leading manufacturer today said, you really ought to be considering this optical scan. And that's when we started evaluating platforms. It was about June that we started lining up demos, started scanning a variety of different types of paddles. So clearly this raw carbon, which we all know it's a molded surface, was being evaluated for its roughness, but also there were a couple of other very unique configurations and approaches to roughening up the surface of the paddle. A peel ply, old school peel ply, but also there have been a couple of other pretty creative approaches to introducing more texture in the paddle surface. So we approached 3 different platform manufacturers in this space. We had rigorous tests done up front. We went through a fairly long cycle in that case, and then finally got the budget approved in late Q4. And we received, it takes a while to configure these, so we just received our system within the last 2 weeks. I haven't been in place long enough to configure it yet, but I have gone through a tune-up on the platform at the factory here just a week ago, right before the Newport event. And so we're comfortable in starting that process internally. NTS, as I mentioned, is acquiring the system as well. And so we'll be moving forward with that here in Q2. And again, we'll enroll and engage the ecosystem, the manufacturers out there for their feedback as well. This isn't something that we'll just create and hand down or hand off to them. They'll get a good heads up on what this looks like and actually input on the specifications that they feel might be relevant. There's some very smart engineering teams out there that we do benefit in working closely with.
Cool. Well, I was curious, Carl, how often does a paddle come in and fail approval? Are you allowed to tell us those numbers?
So there's essentially three levels of approvals, right? There's certification, so the front end. There's market compliance, which I described as you will buy or discreetly source a paddle from a reseller or distributor. And then, of course, there's courtside compliance, which is kind of the theme of the day, which we'll talk about shortly. On the front end, I'd say somewhere between 8 and 12% fail on their initial application. So it's not terrible. It's important to note that this is an open book test. So they have all the specifications. They've got access to all the profiles and configurations of the testing equipment. And in most cases, if they have an issue during the development phase, they'll give us a call as well, and we'll be able to talk them through it. So I do want to reinforce, there's no element of gotcha to this. We're very transparent on this side. And, so we're comfortable that in most cases, if there's an issue when they send it in, perhaps they weren't able to do the coefficient of friction test, for example. That does require a pretty significant piece of equipment. The Instron 336-6 is what we use. And so we do have a prototyping service available. If a paddle manufacturer wants to test something before they send it in for the official certification process, they can ship it off to our labs for a quick wash and wax and test prior to going into production. And that gives them a chance, by the way, to tweak their design a little bit. We've received 3 samples in 3 different roughnesses or 3 different finishes that a manufacturer will solicit feedback from the lab during the prototyping phase, and then they'll land on the one that's legal, and then they'll go into production with that.
Are you allowed to share what usually fails in those tests? Like if it's grit, like what's the more common thing that leads them to fail?
It's more common than surface roughness, and then probably behind that would be the coefficient of friction. Rarely the deflection. It's not too frequently that we see that, and unfortunately, we'll even see dimensioning, a paddle that's exceeded the 24 inches as well. So that doesn't happen too often.
Well, Carl, let me ask you this. I guess as pickleball grows, and obviously you need to scale some of this testing, you did mention before that companies can kind of send in their paddles for almost like a pre-test, before it goes into certification. Do you foresee maybe USAP potentially outsourcing that to other companies so that you can like scale things a little bit better? Because I'd imagine that if everybody made a paddle, right, and they kind of wanted to get pre-tested, that you would also get a high volume there as well. And maybe there's another company that could also do it and then say, hey, this will most likely pass, and then they can then send it to you for the actual like certification.
Sure. At present, Will, it's actually NTS that does the prototyping. So they're set up for high volume ingestion and processing, and they generate an official report for them afterwards, even if it's just a prototyping test.
I see. Are they the only one right now?
Well, many of the manufacturers actually have their own labs internally located within their R&D. So it's a mix of they do their own work. If they're a smaller company and they don't have the equipment, that they can send it to NTS. But frankly, I mean, it's a good question. The specifications are publicly available, and so they could, in theory, take it to their local testing lab. There are many different entities like this nationally, and in theory, they should be able to calibrate their equipment to be able to conduct the tests. Again, it's an open book test. The equipment or the specifications are available to the manufacturers, and so they could take it down to their local lab if they have one.
So I have a bunch of things related to kind of some of the guidelines right now, but one I would love for you to expand on is there are certain areas of the rules where it seems like some companies have gotten past, not in a malicious way, but the way the rule is worded, it seems like it wouldn't pass. And just some examples I have, 2E, 6E says removable parts, no removable parts except for paddle grip adjustments and or grip wraps, lead tape on the paddle edge. And ProKenix has the removable edge bumpers and I think diadem. So I would think that would fail based on that rule, but obviously it's on the market and it's allowed. Can you kind of expand on how that was able to make it past, or if maybe the rule just needs to be reworded?
Sure. A couple of things. I mean, that's well spotted. Keeping in mind what the intent of a rule is. In this case, it's one of safety. And so, if a paddle manufacturer's been able to engineer a removable edge guard or something else, along that line, and it doesn't fly off in competition, we don't have an issue with that. That's the nature of that rule, is that people aren't fixing something to the edge of their paddle that can get knocked off, during a rally or during a contact between players, for example. So that's important to note. The other thing, though, again, good observation. While we don't change the paddle specifications, standards, and rules on this annual beat rate that the rules of play evolve, for good reason. One is manufacturers don't need something different every year, right? They've got multi-year productions based on what we've established as the standards. That doesn't mean that we're not looking at them to optimize or make more efficient or clean up artifacts. These rules have been around a while related to paddles. So there's a notice of proposed rulemaking that we're going to introduce here shortly, that addresses some things that have been there for quite some time that our objective tests replace. And so our objective tests, for example, surface roughness, will expose whatever it is you use to increase the surface terrain of a paddle. So, the introduction of grit or sand particles or, manufacturers have figured out a way to get around some of these things by introducing, chemistry-driven, crystallized surface applications. So really we felt, all right, we've introduced a far more sophisticated test initially with the surface profilometer, and then tomorrow with the optical profiler. And so there's no reason to leave some of these artifacts in there. So we'll streamline some of those over time. And we have found, frankly, that some of the it wasn't a streamlining, but it was intended to make the rules, the general rules of play, which are tweaked every year or updated every year, to make them more readable. So 2 years ago, we extracted a lot of the technical detail that we felt was probably not of interest to the consumer. Some of the deeper specifications and test protocols, and we created a standalone equipment standards document, which is publicly available as well. However, in that edit, we removed a reference to no holes in the paddle surface or in the hitting surface, which created some confusion when the first open throat paddles were introduced. And so I've had many individual communications with people to explain the full text of the rule reads no holes that induce additional friction. So kind of like on a paddle face. So those open throats, which is a natural evolution of every paddle and racket sport anyway, that's not a hole, that's a pass-through or an open throat. Those vents on the side of one paddle manufacturer's products, those are within a half an inch of the bumper guard, not considered, in the primary hitting surface. And so we've signed off on those designs.
Yeah, so that was actually one of the next things I wanted to talk about was that design, because I know when it happened, I think everyone in the market was kind of like, well, how did this pass? It says no holes, and then it became, well, how are we defining the...
Talking about the arrow shot, right?
Yes.
The one shot?
Yes.
The paddle one shot with the holes on the side? Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Correct. And one thing, so the Selkirk, I can kind of understand, a little bit more in the throat, and some new ones are specifically making an actual throat that isn't anywhere near the hitting surface. But one thing I was really curious about is I've had a couple friends in tournaments where there's like a really small crack, like in the corner of their face, like not an area you would really hit, and the ref has made them retire the paddle, and usually the reasoning is, well, if the ball were to hit there, it may deflect a little weird, maybe in an unintended way.
Yeah.
And it made me think of the one shot, because even though it's, it's not in an area you intend to hit, it is an area you could hit. And I would probably argue that those holes would cause a bigger impact than like a really small crack in the corner. Do you have any thoughts about just how that rule is applied to cracks in the paddle face versus like these holes or vents that are up the sides?
Sure.
Specifically for the one shot, because that's a little more obvious example.
Sure. I think the difference is one is designed and the other one is damage.
Sure.
The cracked edge, which I do to every paddle I own, I prop strike, when I'm making a get, I hit the corner of the paddle, and eventually I'll crush or burn up, that corner, the bumper guard, and crush any material in the corner. So that is a damaged face, and that's the premise of the retirement that's been asked for or demanded by the official.
Sure. Yep. That makes sense. That was a good answer. Well, the next thing I kind of want to go into is, it's been alluded to in the past, like how, kind of, I think previously it was referred to as kind of like a secret Santa shopper type thing where, you're evaluating paddles that are on the market, buying them from wherever you please. How do you keep in check every brand? Because I can't imagine it's feasible to be buying every single paddle on the market. I mean, there's just so many of them, and there's so many different brands. The ones I'm particularly curious about are just the smaller brands, because it's a lot easier for them to go under the radar versus like a Selkirk.
Right. It's specification driven, Chris. And so we get a report, a roll-up of all the testing done from NTS. And from that, we can look at, all what we would consider the critical specifications, coefficient of friction, surface roughness, and deflection. And looking at those, if they're within, a certain percentage of the maximum threshold, they go into our 10% club. And they become paddles of interest, if you would. And so we distributors or resellers out there to test to confirm that their specifications are still what the engineering community would call in family, so still within a couple percentage points of the original specification. They're not deviating significantly from that. And even if it's legal, by the way, so a paddle comes in at, let's say, 34, and we source RT, and we source it, and we test it down at 38 or 39. We wouldn't consider that in family. That's a significant departure from what they tested at initially. And so we would, what our process is there is that we'll generally contact the manufacturer first and say, this is what we've discovered. Talk through, if they have any understanding of any QC issues that they may be having. We'll generally, in parallel to that, be sourcing a second paddle as well. And if that one also fails the screen, then we'll send them into NTS for an official compliance test. If the paddles fail those, then I bring on our chief engineer and connect them with their engineering team, and they start to understand the scope, how large a population of paddles are out there, what's the root cause, the potential root cause of it, what's the fix as well to address it. And if extreme measures are required, then we may take them. If there's no understanding of when the excursion or notice of escape for the escape may have happened, then we have to lean in a bit more, to prevent any further paddles from being shipped into the market. That's a pretty severe position to take, and we prefer to try to solve the problem first. Well,
speaking of solving problems, have you ever caught a paddle in the market that's out of spec besides carbon? And if so, run us through the process of what you did about it and how you go about it.
And just to add to that really quick, what I'd be most curious about is, so carbon last year, obviously that was a much more public thing. It was, banned in the middle of a tournament, which was we hadn't really seen that before. I imagine some are handled more so, you notice, you talk to the manufacturer, you get it done. But then obviously there was the carbon where it was kind of overnight. It was you can't use these anymore. So can you walk us through how it would become one or the other?
Sure. I think in the case of what Will teed up there have been a number of excursions in the past where paddles that we've sourced from through our compliance process, our market compliance process, have failed, where we've connected with the manufacturer, and that process that I described earlier. We have to understand what's the existing population of potentially affected paddles out there. Can that be bounded? Can we define what the number is? Is it a number that's large enough that we should be concerned about? Is there an understood root cause of the problem, and how long to fix that? So there's a number of variables that we evaluate that drive how we address it and how we handle it. And so there have been probably no less than 4 since, there's been 6 actually since I've been on board. And generally speaking, we've been able to handle them, contain the population very quickly. The manufacturer's been able to define this, through lot control, through a close relationship with their supplier, and so that they were very well defined. The situation with CRBN, and the reason why it seemed like it happened overnight is that it was difficult for us to acquire market samples, but we'd heard about it for some time, that there may be a concern. And so we were able to source some, we were able to quickly check them, and a decision had to be made fairly quickly because, clearly there were concerns that players were competing with these paddles and creating essentially an unfair environment or a non-level field of competition out there. So the decision was taken fairly quickly. It was data driven, though. but it was compressed because of that lack of availability to even sample the paddle.
I think correct me if I'm wrong on how many brands you've caught on the market. So since you have been on, you were saying you've caught about 6 brands that failed market compliance.
I don't like to use the word caught. It's not meant to be a gotcha. And it's generally, we're assisting them with it's a quality control and quality assurance process. Many of these manufacturers are, frankly, that there might be a couple guys, that are launching their own brand, but they're sourcing offshore, and there may not be the visibility, A, into the quality control process, B, the experience in manufacturing. That's critical to understand, that. And in some cases, many people are launching a brand that has what they believe to be, will be successful on the market, but they may not have the engineering and manufacturing expertise really up front. So we try to identify these. Clearly, we want it to be a level playing field for the paddle manufacturers. It's, from their perspective, they don't want to feel like their competitors are bringing paddles to market that are not legal, that may provide some type of perceived market edge over their own products. And then down at the level of competition, clearly players don't want to feel like their competitors are using paddles that are out of spec either. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like it happens a bit. I can kind of give you an example, and this kind of leads into some other stuff.
You should definitely tell them the story.
Yeah, for sure. So I had gotten a Starrett last year, and I had talked to some manufacturers to make sure that I was using it properly. I had done some calls with them to make sure it was calibrated properly. And now I'm definitely not NTS. I know that their standards are going to be a little bit higher, but I had just gone to some local shops to test a bunch of paddles, and there were, brands that 8 out of 8 paddles were failing, probably 10% plus. And I made a whole spreadsheet. I probably logged well over 100 paddles from a shop, and I had actually sent it to someone at USAP. It wasn't you, and we could talk about who later or whatever, but I had given them the data, and it wasn't so much to be like, I did phrase the email a little poorly. I was like, hey, I was just planning to talk about this in a video. Could you kind of expand on this? And I had a phone call with them, and the phone call basically resulted in, don't publish any of that data. I actually talked to one of the manufacturers that you are claiming is over, and they are telling me that if you publish that data, they will sue you. And then the rest of the phone call kind of resulted in them being like, yeah, you should just stay quiet about this. And for me, it was like a little bit off-putting because, one, I was just trying to bring to attention, like, hey, I'm seeing a problem. Like, do with this what you will. But it felt kind of weird to be like, hey, be quiet. And I think it kind of goes to another thing that the general pickleball community has been worried about, is just like transparency and are things being handled fairly. I know you can't really talk about my specific situation. You weren't involved with it, but it did feel weird to kind of have that interaction.
Sure.
Do you have like any thoughts on just like
that spreadsheet? I still think you should post it, or at least make a video or talk about it. You put so much hours into building that thing out.
Yeah, it was a lot of testing. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on just kind of that whole thing? It's kind of like a loaded question.
No, that's all right. I can handle it. So I think philosophically, there's a responsibility in reporting data that could possibly be damaging. And so that responsibility needs to be supported by testing parameters that are accepted, which includes the environment. There's a lot of variables that the lab maintains when they test, and so I can understand the concern of the manufacturer, the position of your contact initially, in that. This is, without the controls of a lab, releasing this data, it could be potentially damaging. And so,
for sure.
And so I think there was, part of it was related to that. I think also the manufacturers do understand that they need to maintain a level of quality control. And I think in the early days, especially with this type of surface, that it was a very difficult thing. And I think I continue to remain concerned about it. That's why we've made the investments in the optical profiler. That's why we're investing in not upgraded, but we're turning up the volume on the compliance frequency, testing frequency as well. And so we're trying to address that as quickly as we can. And then back to the manufacturer side and transparency. It's always difficult to know what a person considers, what transparency is, what their expectations and, what they really are entitled to. In some cases, we're talking about IPR, intellectual property rights, right? And so it's a very delicate line to start releasing data like that. We have confidential relationships, of course, with all the manufacturers. If they fail a test or the data related to a passing test is confidential between USA Pickleball and the manufacturer. In the event of a failure, clearly, they want to remedy the situation as quickly as possible. And we get our engineering teams talking, right away to help solve that. Again, it's up to the manufacturer if they decide to release the data. It is their data in the end. And so when people demand transparency, that's a pretty broad brush. What does that mean? What should your expectations be as well? And to also give the manufacturers a chance to remedy the situation. And if they want to disclose what the limits were that they've exceeded, what the failure mode was, we've got some very interesting, topics related to failure modes, which I'm sure we'll touch here shortly when it comes to the whole delamination issue. So anyway, again, it was a long way around, I think, to answer your question, but hopefully I did address it.
I can see where you're coming from, but also at the same time, yes, it's their data, but if this is something done by Chris or myself or somebody independent, it's our data. We can choose to relay this information, if we like, right? And I don't see how that really affects, the companies or what USAP does, because we are not the authority, right? We are just presenting our own data, and where is the line between that? Why couldn't just somebody independently go do their own research and present what they want to do?
As long as you're entirely comfortable that research and the data is unimpeachable, because once you do release data related to the performance of a product, and if you're saying that this legal or previously considered legal product you've tested as illegal, you need to be able to stand behind that and produce, because if you are pressed, you would be asked to produce your testing methodology, your qualifications. It's just something to consider. And so I don't think anybody could stop you from doing it. I'm not asking to stop you. I'm just saying that if you do acquire data like this and you feel it necessary to publish it, then you have to be able to stand behind it as well in terms of the methodology, the conditions, all of the things that are put in place up front during the certification process, because you're comparing your studio-based test to a nationally certified lab. And so it's just a point. I come from the semiconductor industry, and IPR was, something that was protected very, closely. And when it came down to understanding failure modes and pushing back on quality issues, things like that, you really had to have your data square before you did that.
For sure. One thing I wanted to be just curious if you are aware of is, so I talked to quite a few manufacturers, and I obviously see a lot of paddles myself. One thing that I started noticing was happening in the industry is that companies were sending in for approval, specifically the raw carbon paddles. I think we kind of know that usually those are the ones, when we're talking about grit, that's kind of the ones that are most involved. But they'll send in whether it's the company choosing to do it or the factory, I've heard it both ways, but they'll send in a lower grit version to guarantee the pass, and then they'll up it for production. Not necessarily to illegal amounts. It may even still be legal, but I was just curious if USAP was aware of factories starting to do that.
Yes, and that was the basis of my comment earlier.
Sure.
So a couple of trends that we've noticed. Every one of these new, I'll air quote this, raw carbon face paddles, I log as a specific surface type. So that's the first thing. The second is, of course, as I mentioned, we get the data from NTS in terms of what the numbers were, both the detailed single paddle report as well as a full summary of every paddle, which we can analyze for how close they are to the limits. So looking at a combination of those two, and also driven by what we've heard, a similar commentary in the industry that this may be happening. That is what's really driving a big part of our increased compliance program. So it could be a smaller company, but if they're shipping these new this new technology or relatively new technology out into the market, if they're close to the limit, or if they're this type of paddle, then we're sampling them and testing them to make sure that whatever is available through a reseller or distributor is, as I mentioned, within family. And by within family, I mean within 5 to 10% of the original paddle that was certified.
Sure, makes sense. Well, I want to move on a little bit just to talk about some of the new testing measurements that are in place. And the first thing I want to go over is, this may be a couple things we have to go into, but we'll specifically talk about the on-site testing, because I think there has been, not necessarily because of you guys, but there's just been a lack of understanding of what the current on-site tests are. The ones that I feel I'm aware of would be grit, delamination or debonding, and deflection. Can you just tell us what all of the current on-site things, like even the last Newport tournament, like what was being tested for and what are the proper terms for them?
Sure. I think in order to explain this, maybe a little bit of history. So we introduced surface roughness testing at the Nationals, the USA Pickleball Nationals at Indian Wells last year. One of my colleagues on the EEC and I processed over 150 pro athletes' paddles during that period, testing for surface roughness, documenting it as well. And then if it did pass, we would apply a non-removable sticker to the paddle, and we would track it through the course of the tournament. This year, we approached the pro leagues and offered some type of compliance support at the events, initially offering surface roughness. So rather than sticking with the SR160, we upgraded to a couple of the SR300s, which have a higher spec, and you can see an exposed stylus, which you can track a little bit easier and place on the paddle with precision as well if you want to test a certain surface feature. And it's got a very nice visual display that shows you what the roughness looks like as well. So it's been very effective. And just like the other testing methodologies that I talked about earlier, the crawl, walk, run approach applies to this. And so this isn't a photograph, right? This is a motion picture. So by that I mean, we started with surface roughness in February. We're during March, once this disbonding, delamination, crush core situation started to come to it started to become very visible. We immediately responded, and our chief engineer recommended a solution that's used in the aerospace industry, which is an ultrasonic bond tester. So this isn't new, it's an off-the-shelf, industry proven testing platform, non-destructive testing platform. And so we immediately started demoing that as early as March. And so since then, we've acquired a system and we spent time with their field applications engineering team to get spun up very quickly on it. to set up profiles to test different paddle types as well, because they're not all the same, different thicknesses, different types, like the laid up, fully molded paddles are different than the traditional sandwich type paddles. And so over time, we've layered in this additional test, which is it's a kind of a facsimile of the deflection test. But the deflection test really requires a heavy piece of equipment to do properly, which is that Instron platform that I described earlier. And so, in this case, this serves as a proxy essentially for deflection by testing for elements or breakdown in the paddle subsurface that results in increased deflection. And so the assumption is, and the proof is that off the shelf, these are legal paddles, but because of the frequency of disbonding and delamination, as this is, and the umbrella term is delamination, what we're really worried about is crush core and disbonding. But delamination describes all of it. It's embedded in 2E2 as a requirement for a player to retire a paddle that has delaminated. And delamination's been around forever. Right.
Yeah.
It's a natural decay in this beam, that we call a paddle. After a while, it starts to break down. Either the bonding material between surface ply and core starts to let go, or the core starts to break down. Most of us would chuck it in the bin after it starts to become too mushy. And so, because of the reaction with this new generation of paddles that essentially have a frame around the outside of the paddle, we've seen a different characteristic when they start to disbond and the core gets crushed. We do believe that crushed core could be driven by basically a compromise made in the design. It could be thinner cell walls within the core to offset the weight gain that the frame introduces. There could be issues with the thermoforming process that might disrupt the integrity of the polymer core as well, and maybe too high a heat. So we leave that, those solutions to the ecosystem to figure out and sort. We also believe that those paddle manufacturers that are experiencing this failure mode do pay the price in terms of returns as well.
Yeah.
And so back to answer your question. The introduction of this ultrasonic test was first tested, and then we've layered it in. The first event was the PPA Newport Beach event, where not only did we do surface roughness with the SR300, but we've also layered in this ultrasonic tester, which uses this ultrasonic probe, which has a pitch and catch in terms of the signal. And then we measure the consistency of that signal from a known good area near the throat all the way up into the paddle face where the contact occurs. And if there's a huge differential between the two, if the XY graph shows a phase change or a significant spread in the signal, we know that something's breaking down into subsurface area.
So is it just two primary on-site tests right now? It's grit and essentially debonding?
It is, I would call it surface roughness as opposed to grit.
Surface roughness, yep.
And yep. we will be migrating that surface roughness to the optical scanner. We'll be taking that on the road this quarter once we get it calibrated and we get the right kind of luggage to haul this 40-pound piece of equipment around as well.
Yes. And then would you call the other one like a debonding test?
Disbonding, yes.
Disbonding. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's just those two things right now, because the disbonding and deflection would be two different things, and currently deflection is not tested on site.
Correct, but they're closely related. The failure in disbonding creates a deflection issue.
Yes, definitely.
Which is the issue. I mean, they're tightly related. But
sure.
It's interesting that you bring that up. Terms have been used interchangeably, unfortunately. Dwell, deflection, delamination, coefficient of restitution, which is really the thing that we're concerned about, is coefficient of restitution. Yes. The deflection test as we have it today is as close as we could come to it, but do know that we're researching how to transition from that older type test to something that more accurately measures and describes the contact between ball and paddle.
Yeah, and it's good you brought this up because I actually discovered this just the other day, and I wanted to talk to you about it a little bit. So I review paddles all the time, so I have every thermoformed paddle on the market, and I have people testing them for me. And once we started seeing the delamination issues, I started having people durability test them for me, just having people play with them because I can't play with all of them quick enough and break them down quick enough.
Sure.
So I have a number of delaminated paddles, but when I cut them open, I noticed, and no one on the internet had been talking about it until you had just said it, but I actually noticed that it wasn't so much that the face was unglued. It was literally just that the core is destroyed. Like if you take it apart,
right,
the beams inside of the polymer are completely crushed. And if you take your hand and press, you can just see the core collapsing on itself. And that's the crinkling that people are hearing is the core, not glue or something else. And only in the instances of the paddles I had, but those did not have any delamination on them. And so I thought it was, obviously you've been aware of it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand what those terms really mean. So if you look at the traditional paddle, with surface plies, they actually consist of, let's say, 3 carbon plies, right, that are adhered together. And then there's, of course, the core here, which is is much deeper. Delamination is actually the separation of these plies. Yep. Disbonding is the separation of the surface ply from the core, but it doesn't mean that there's any room for this facial ply to move, to store, and return energy. So it's that it's that crush core below the ply, the surface plies, that allows a little bit of room for the surface ply to flex, store energy, and then return it in an unexpected bounce, off the face of the paddle. And so,
can the disbonding test currently check for a crushed core, or what's the way of knowing that the core is crushed?
It can. So,
okay.
So when we scan around the known good area down around the throat, where there's generally no damage, there shouldn't be any damage through normal contact. We establish a certain frequency and gain, and so it's known good. And we establish a nice tight pattern down there, and then as we move up through the paddle face, you'll see the phase change within the XY scope, and then there's also an RF signal that we look at, and I'll send you a couple of images afterwards. You can drop into this after you post it or post-produce it, but that show just how this RF signal will exceed the fences as well. It'll go up, it'll exceed the boundaries of the fence, and so the known signal's established on a known good area, and once you move into the damaged area, it refracts, and you don't get the same signal as you would previously.
Gotcha. I have one other thing I just want to follow up on that. How much of the current testing that you've done have you noticed that the actual issue is delamination or disbonding versus the crushed core? Because now that I've cut these apart, every paddle that we have called delaminated and referred to as it hits much harder, every single one of those has had a crushed core. I'm basing that, just off the crunching sound by pressing into the face. It seems like that is probably, I'm going to make up a number here, but to me it would be like 90% of the issue, and it's not so much the face plies separating and being an issue, it's more so the core. Right,
that's true. And really physically the only way that face can store and return energy is if there's room underneath it. And so your analysis there is correct. Really the core has to be crushed in order for this effect to happen. And as we've learned this last weekend, it's not limited to paddles with this frame around it. And so paddles have been retired due to this issue that are more conventional in construction with ply, core, and ply with no bounding frame around it. So what we found is that that crush core, if it's underneath the surface that can store and return energy like these carbon fiber surfaces, then in all likelihood they may present an issue in the future. So we're confident that this very mature technology will be able to identify paddles that have started to break down to the point to where there may be a competitive advantage, where at least there may be a significant change in power off the face of the paddle. I think we all know that there's a loss of control generally with this as well, and most players that I've seen quickly retire them, once this happens.
Speaking of the pros, we know that some pros get custom paddles, right? And that aren't what's available to the rest of the market, like, off the shelf we can purchase, right? So what do you think about that? I mean, it's not something new, right? I mean, tennis does this, other professional sports does this as well, but
yeah,
how about in pickleball?
Yeah. I've heard, reference to this as well. Frankly, what changes could they make to the paddle that wouldn't be detectable? That's my first question. Obviously, they're probably taking a precise approach to weighting the paddle to the player's specification. So using a swing weight machine is the way to do that. There's nothing against that. If there's some way that they can materially change the core to where it behaves differently. I've not gotten my hands on a paddle and done an autopsy yet to see, what they possibly could have done to change it. Clearly, if there are modifications being made that do change the deflection characteristics of the paddle, then that would be considered an illegal paddle. If those deflection specs exceeded 0.005, for example. So there it's a gray area. I'm not sure what else they could do. From a roughness standpoint, I don't know how they could introduce even more roughness to a paddle that's at 39. Because it's not the type of material that you can actually post-process and improve that roughness. They generally only wear down.
Well, one way that I was thinking, and it may not necessarily even be a bad thing, but I think there are alleged paddles from pros where maybe the consumer version is very smooth, and then the pros version may just have a grit coating on top of it. Maybe it falls within specification. Maybe there's a couple other changes, but would normally, if a company did that, would that paddle need to go through a recertification if the consumer version was smooth, but then they added, let's just say, a grit layer that went all the way up to the legal limit? Would that require recertification or no?
At this point, we're not mapping back a pro-tested paddle back into the compliance testing process. That may be something we do in the future, but right now our agreement is that we're really testing for legality at courtside.
Sure.
At courtside,
Sure.
And so, to be frank, if I tested a couple of pro athletes, paddles at courtside, and I know for a fact they're significantly different than the legal paddle, I'd have a conversation with the manufacturer to say, you might be missetting market expectations.
Sure.
In this case. At present, the testing that we do is to test for legality, not for compliance to original certification. That's not to say we wouldn't do that in the future, but today we're not doing that.
Gotcha. Do you have any thoughts on? So I think the testing you guys have been doing on site's been great, and people, I think in the last couple of weeks we have a much more clear picture of where things have been going, but it always feels like when there is some of this controversy going on that USAP is a little quiet. And, I know you mentioned transparency can be a little hard to clarify, but I think just helping the market kind of understand what's going on from the governing body would be good. For example, like the crushed core thing you were talking about, I think there's been a lot of misinformation about it's delamination and people are mixing up dwell time and deflection and all these things. I think it would be great if USAP was kind of putting out statements like, hey, here's the testing we've been working on. We've, kind of realized it's actually a core that's being compromised and that's what's causing some of this. Is there a conflict with the companies as a reason you can't say that, or have you guys not thought about it much, or kind of where do you sit with that?
Well, I think part of it is educating the market. I agree. If at a philosophical level, that educating the market's important, and it's an important role for us. It just depends on what do we leave to manufacturers. What is, frankly, from a confidentiality perspective, what is good, is okay for us to release. I think we could do more in this area, and based on the number of interviews that we've done relative to this over the last 2 months, I think we are making good strides there. As far as issuing a press release, there are bigger things that I think we're working on, that our media team is focused on. We are certainly accessible. My apologies for taking so long to meet with you. But
you're good.
But it's not like we're saying no comment. You ask the question, and this it's something I want to clarify too. Is if you ask, we'll answer. But examples around the open throat thing before. We don't take a position to say it's now okay to go out and do open throats. There are certain things that a governing body does and certain things that a governing body doesn't. Our main focus is helping grow the sport through rulemaking as they relate to equipment, through grassroots growth programs, developing an enabled and qualified ambassador network, those type of things. And I think in this process, talking to industry voices like yours, I think this is the environment I think that makes more sense than a press release saying this is what's happening with these paddles today. This is a technical conversation. The 100,000 plus recipients of a newsletter. A USA Pickleball newsletter, that probably isn't the approach we would use for this type of data.
Sure, understandable.
But big picture, I agree. It is our job to educate, and we're trying to do so. We've been able to have several articles related to this in Pickleball magazine, and so we've got a fairly good beat rate in terms of updates there on what's going on in our newsletter as well. So we've been given a platform, through our marketing team to use some of our digital content more frequently, but also availability to do this kind of thing that I believe is quite important.
So when a paddle is challenged at the PPA and the paddle is sent in, do you get to see or know the results? Personally, I've been the one at courtside doing the testing during this pilot. This is essentially a pilot that we're running right now, so I've been involved in all of this. If a paddle is sent in somewhere for testing, it's to our labs, and so essentially USA Pickleball is running point on driving this through the labs, for a quick turnaround and communication back to the PPA to execute its policy. At this point, so we're essentially, technical consultants in this role with the PPA, with MLP, perhaps, and then certainly with APP as well. We'll be on site for the New York event. We'll be doing some pilot testing, more than likely at the Cincinnati event here in a week and a half. We'll be on site for the event coming up next weekend for the PPA as well, with at minimum these two tests. We may introduce a dimensioning test as well, to make sure they're 24 inches or less. But in all likelihood, we'll stick with the two most meaningful measurements during this period.
Yeah, so an example of kind of what Will was talking about there that I'd love to know more about is I think right now there's a worry in the community, in the pro scene of, some of the paddle testing is done behind closed doors, a paddle shipped off. We don't really know what happens, and there's not necessarily statements made about it. For example, when Salome's paddle got challenged and sent in, the PPA or USAP, it's probably more on the PPA to their responsibility to make a press statement, but they didn't say anything. And then Salome released and said, hey, my paddle passed, and then Leah Jansen made some statements. And now I think, people are wondering about Tyson's paddle was recently sent in the match where Travis had challenged that, and there's been no statement or follow-up on what happened there, and I think people are just concerned, if nothing is said, did it pass, did it not pass, and they don't want to say. So I'm just curious if you can kind of speak to any of that.
Well, as I mentioned before, we're serving in a technical capacity, supporting the leagues, the pro leagues, and also our national championship series. If you take a step back, and I started to allude to this earlier, but I didn't complete the thought, and that was each event that I participated in with the PPA has evolved in terms of policy, in terms of layering in, a new technology, which, we've been supplying and testing process to better get on top of this situation. And so it's a moving, it's a motion picture, as I mentioned before. It's not static. It evolves, it improves each time the event occurs. And so working closely with their officials, their pro player liaison, and with PPA leadership in terms of, what is the fairest approach? What is the reporting process? What is the, player transparency mode? So, for example, for a couple of events, we were in a fairly open area. The problem is that can be viewed by a number of other players, including, competitors. And so we're looking at, is it better to hold this in a very discreet location where, a private conversation can be held with the pro player? We're working on evolving that each time. What is the fairest approach in this case? And so it's not like the Red Rock scenario is going to be the same as an improved policy at Newport Beach and an even more improved policy in Charlotte this coming weekend. And so I'm encouraged by how we've been working with the pro leagues in this area, and specifically the PPA recently, and supporting a number of events for them, and how this is evolving. So I think it's mostly good. We know where we need to make improvements, and I believe we're making those. We, the collective we, both PPA and USA Pickleball, are making improvements each event.
Then, so I'm just curious, like, why, you have all this testing, but why not just have the refs like press into the base of the paddle to check for like cracking, like they do with grit, before the match? I feel like that could mitigate some issues. I guess before you start a match. Yeah,
it's still subjective, and just like the waving of a hand over a paddle face to test for roughness, my sense of touch may not be as fine tuned as yours, and so there's a subjective element to that. Pressing in, you could say that's related to the hand strength of the ref as well. So I believe it's important to have objective tests to do this and test for what's most important. And I think collectively, most people believe that surface roughness and the rigidity of the beam that a paddle should be tested, whether that's by deflection, which is impractical at courtside, or today through this disbonding test that we're doing, but that we're able to do real time and in a more affordable manner today.
Well, and so I feel like with the Will's question, to me, it at least makes sense to try, right? So, like, even right now we do the grit, which, as you mentioned, like, someone could be a little more fine-tuned than another. So if it's not very objective, I guess, why should we even do that one? And then if we aren't going to do that, or if we are, I feel like we might as well just press into the paddle, not as a, hey, this paddle's illegal, retire it, but more as a, let's just try and catch something or see if there's a flag before the match. And if we maybe hear a crinkling, maybe we should check this paddle before we go in. It's just kind of like a flag system, not, hey, this paddle has failed, now you can't use it.
It's almost like our compliance screening. It's not a immediate, if you fail our compliance screening, at our local lab, that you're done. There's a second level of testing done at our labs. So that's a good point. And are you referring to doing this in amateur play? No,
I'm actually more so just talking about the pro play, because, paddles are being challenged more and more frequently amongst the pros, and I think it would just be a good way to be like, okay, maybe there was something wrong, maybe there wasn't, and if there wasn't, go ahead and play. You can challenge after, and we can do better testing. But if I hear cracking, maybe we should check that right now before you start this match, and we have more drama.
I think so. The frequency of testing is increasing. So I was talking about improvements each weekend. Last weekend, well, the weekend before, we had done voluntary, and then the finals. Last weekend, voluntary, quarterfinals, and finals, right? And I think we'll probably blend in semifinals this coming weekend. So the frequency is increasing. The need for a mid-match challenge is decreasing. So this is good for the players, not having to challenge. This is good for the officials, not having to do a subjective test, right? So it does mean that we have to have enough resource and bandwidth to do the actual testing to keep from slowing the tournament down. That's important, especially in a televised tournament that's on a schedule. And so we're working on that to scale it up to be able to provide enough throughput and ensure that there's no bottleneck. Yeah.
One follow-up to that this is kind of more so an example with Tyson's match that I was thinking about the other night. We talk about right now when a player notices, let's just say that their core is broken and that the paddle has become hotter, they should retire it. What if you've played, 3/4 of a game in your match and then you notice it or your opponent notices it and you go, okay, I'm going to retire the paddle. And in Tyson's case, Travis still challenged that paddle following the match. If you willingly gave up the paddle, but you still got to use it during a match, maybe it gave you an advantage during. If it fails later, should you be punished even though you retired the paddle? Like, I feel like it's a really gray area on how the player should be punished or not punished if they willingly gave it up, but they did still get to use it.
Yeah, your question is both one of kind of philosophical, and it is one of policy, which is applied by, respectively by each of the different leagues. And so what I will say is, I believe the direction that we've gone so far, what was implemented last weekend and will likely be so this coming, is that per 2E2, if your paddle is delaminated in the broad brush umbrella term way, that you should not play with it. And so in this case, there's provision, A, for a player to self-retire a paddle, to retire their own paddle if challenged. And of course, a player may challenge their opponent if they observe an odd behavior with your opponent's equipment. And if they feel strongly about it, they should do it. As soon as they think that the player may have an advantage. Why would you why would you not put a finger on it right away and say, okay, let's, I'd like this marked, put a stake in the ground here in game 1 or early in game 2 that says I would like that paddle tested afterwards. And if I, the athlete using the paddle, say, you know what, I think it's going, I'm going to bin it, and I'm going to retire it and pull out a new paddle. I think that's personally, I think that's fair practice. That is the practice that PPA has implemented, and so I think it's a positive way to give the player the opportunity to retire it and not play out through the match.
All right. Well, Carl, what if, I don't know, maybe in some other universe, right, where you don't want to have to deal with these issues whatsoever? Like, are you planning on banning thermoformed paddles, like, from the market, or paddles that frequently, have this core crushing issue?
Yeah, that's a good question, Will. And we're just short of releasing a statement that says, it is incumbent on we don't want to be in a position to tell manufacturers how to build paddles. There are certain specifications, or materials either. We can talk about EVA in a second, but telling them how to build paddles, it really isn't what the direction we want to maintain. We've looked quite a bit away from that over the years with the introduction of more objective tests. The change that I mentioned earlier about pulling the term grit or sanded paint out of it because we've got objective measurements to replace that. That's a logical direction for us to go. So back to your question, telling the paddles that this configuration, or manufacturers that this configuration of paddle is no longer legal, it doesn't give them the chance to remedy the situation from a manufacturing process standpoint, a material selection standpoint, or configuration perspective. It's those three things that they have to sort. I think they were pushing the envelope with this framed type paddle, and I think there's some sorting that had to be done. But pulling certification on these paddles, I don't think is the remedy. I think they, in most cases, they were sourced probably from a single source overseas, and I know for a fact that they've solved the issue as we've described it or discussed it today, and we should be seeing a change very quickly here in terms of the nature of the paddles going to market.
So when you say it's solved, do you think that the core crushing thing will not happen on some of the brands where we've currently been talking about Carbon, Legacy, 6.0? Are you saying you think it's completely gone with those now?
That's my hope. That's the indications I'm getting from the manufacturers. The timing of that blending in, with their shipments, is entirely up to throughput of the factory or factories overseas. Shipping times, all of that are related, to the introduction of those paddles. So we will, because there's been a change in manufacturing, though, we will look for a first article introduction and likely retest these as well to make sure, again, all of the certification specifications are met, because there's been perhaps a significant change in manufacturing. But we're confident that they've assessed the issue. They're making changes in the process stroke materials, and we'll see fewer of these, I'm sure, in the future.
Was there a point in time where you guys considered banning either any of the brands or this type of thing? I know you just said you don't want to, but was that ever considered? Because I think, having myself talk to some of the manufacturers and especially players, I feel like people were really put in kind of a weird spot when there wasn't a statement about how it was going to be handled moving forward. Because if you're a recreational player, you don't want to have happen what happened last year with Carbon, where you bought a paddle, it became illegal, and now you got to go source another one. Maybe people don't have funds for it. And then if you're a manufacturer, you're also a little bit scared to go make more paddles if you think that it may be banned. And I think this kind of goes back to some of the themes I've alluded to before, where just like a statement somewhere on some of this would be helpful, because I think people are in a really weird spot where it's like, should I buy this if USAP might just get rid of all of them? Because I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I might have missed something, but at least up until right now, I hadn't heard anything about USAP saying, no, we won't get rid of these, outside of, conversations you and I have had privately.
Right. So I mentioned earlier that there's a communication that we're working on. Let me take a step back. We first had to do our research on this to understand what the failure mode was. So before you can make any determination, and I don't like to use the word ban. If we're gonna pull certification on a product or products, we need to have quite a bit of data to support that. Not fully understanding what the failure mode was until recently means that it would have been imprudent for us just to say any thermoformed paddle, which we know more paddles are thermoformed than just these framed paddles, right?
Yes.
So how do you define the paddles that you want to pull a certification from? So that's the last resort, right? So we want to solve the problem first. Well, we want to understand the problem first, and then solve the fix or understand what the fix is going to be before making any type of major decision on how it's handled. And then to your point, before going to that extreme, if it looks like it can be addressed, then the paddle manufacturers pay a fairly dear price in returns by manufacturing a paddle that has a very short field life, and so per time in market, and so that's almost Darwinian, right? If they produce a paddle that deteriorates quickly, then in all likelihood, they'll pay a significant price in returns. So none of them are doing this intentionally. And so
I have thought it was pretty ridiculous with a lot of the accusations that companies were doing this on purpose. I think if they were, it was bound to get caught and then banned, or you have to deal with this. Like, I think it was just an unintended. As I have learned more about it, it seems to be an unintended consequence of the manufacturing process.
That's correct. That's correct. And as I mentioned, I'm confident that they're addressing that. So I'm glad we didn't make a hasty decision on pulling certification on these just due to their configuration, because two of the paddles that have been quite visible in delamination failure recently weren't of this same configuration. And so it would have been an incorrect position for us to have taken to begin with. It wouldn't have explained the other two failures that we've heard about.
So, since currently everyone is worried about the speed of the game, with paddles, why not just regulate the ball more and loosen the paddle guidelines a bit?
Well, the balls are regulated pretty tightly. 30 to 34-inch bounce from 6.5 feet. On a granite surface. What we're not testing is ballistic. Using a ballistic test, which would benefit us also on the paddle coefficient of restitution side. But there's 100 variables, that we need to take into consideration: temperature, which ball do we test with, things like that. So, and there's several different core tests that you can conduct as well that measure different aspects of it. And so I think there's not a fast fix here. We are concerned, Will, that equipment not introduce an inordinate amount of power into the game. We believe this is a game of finesse primarily, but it is a game that has a significant dynamic range. It's got the precision of golf on the green. It's got the finesse of an approach shot, and it's got all the power off the tee that that the sport of golf has. The difference is this is aerobic, and we believe that's okay to define the sport in that context. That is, it does have a wide dynamic range, but it is initially and primarily a game of finesse. Paddles that introduce a significant amount of power, that add a lot of power, what we're seeing are those paddles with a ton of deflection. We're doing some tests on paddles that were not intended for certification, and we're not going to publish these results, but it does give us a better understanding of some paddles that are being referred to as hot, right? So I anticipate, one of the paddles that I'm referring to, I won't name it, but I can press my thumbs into it and feel the deflection. So I think what we've been testing actually is a pretty good corollary for power. It's not as sophisticated as a dynamic and ballistic core test, coefficient of restitution test, but it has served us well up until now. But that doesn't mean it will not advance the ball in terms of testing and methodology around that.
So I think with Will's original question, I think he was more thinking the ball is obviously regulated, but maybe it's easier to control what we do with the ball and change the game there and loosen what happens with paddles. Like maybe we say we're only going to start allowing a softer ball moving forward so that you can make your paddle deflect a bunch, but we're going to do things with the ball that make it so that your paddle speed is negated versus if you were to, continue playing with a Dura. Do you think that's a viable option, or is that not something you guys think you'll try?
Well, we know that there's already softer balls out there. They're generally the injection molded balls. We do know that the hard balls, they're rotomolded balls, are typically faster and harder. And then, we move into injection molded balls. They're quieter, by the way, as well. So there's a ancillary benefit to that, from an acoustic standpoint. I don't feel a trend internally, that's believed to be a necessary direction for us. That is a fairly logical approach, though. I mean, we could go all the way to a foam ball, if we really wanted to slow it down. The hard balls. What's interesting though is that there's a conventional wisdom that hard balls don't deflect or compress at all, and that's not true. This is a 2-inch diameter contact patch in a direct. This is the hardest rotomolded ball in the market, and it crushes significantly on contact. And so our understanding of the physics around the ball deflection, ball characteristics, those are very important for us for a number of reasons. Looking at the performance on the court, looking at potential adjustments that can be made for acoustics as well. Frankly speaking, we haven't looked at it as the means of slowing down the game.
Sure.
That's insightful, though, because that's what they did in squash, Chris. They did exactly that in squash. That's a good point.
I feel like it makes a lot of sense because with the ball, let's just say we went super extreme. We went to a foam ball. You've now probably eliminated the noise or very drastically reduced it to a point of no more complaints. And then, let's say people were using a delaminated paddle. The speed of it is much less of an issue than, say, some of these really hard plastic balls. So I just feel like we knock out a lot of things by changing the ball. And obviously it's a drastic approach, right? Like if we were to start using a foam ball, that does change the game a lot, but at least on the equipment side of things, I would think it's much easier for everyone. At a pro tournament, the ref supplies the ball, the player or the manufacturer can't do anything to influence that ball. They can use the paddle they want, and now everything just kind of revolves around the ball, so it feels like it would be maybe the best approach to solving it.
It's certainly the common denominator, and it takes the complexity out of looking at 2,000 different paddles. It definitely does that. So certainly something to think about.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Well, the last main topic I want to talk about, I know we've been going quite a while here, but I wanted to just kind of get your take on the whole Pickle Pro Labs thing. I wanted to know, if you know who they are you involved, and kind of are you worried at all about another entity coming in and kind of defining standards? Because I was reading over their sheet, and one quote that was in the document is that it said, "It is PPL's view that the currently accepted deflection tests in the market include inadequately defined deflection locations, insufficient loading criteria, and do not test both in a static and dynamic manner." Obviously, they're talking about a coefficient of restitution test there. Are you... I guess, how do you respond to that statement? Because I feel like as another one comes in, it's going to complicate things even more.
Yeah. My answers to your first three questions are yes, no, and yes.
Sure.
So I met the team in Daytona. They were on site doing a very thorough, very tightly controlled, from a chain of custody standpoint, process. I had a chance to briefly, talk about things at a higher level, Brooks, Wiley, about working together. This team was, clearly the PPL team was clearly pretty deep into a research project, which was very confidential. We've not had an opportunity. While I did meet them, we've not had an opportunity to have a team-on-team discussion with our chief engineer and their lead engineers to understand the approach, the objectives as well. And so the third answer to your question is yes. Without some type of at least discussion about what the desired outcomes are of this, I would be concerned.
Yeah.
And so the plan is, to meet and discuss with MLP leadership, who has contracted this external engineering team, to talk about objectives and roadmap as well. We certainly don't want to see confusion in the ecosystem in terms of what's next, what's going to be considered the thing to measure. The governing body is responsible for defining most of these specifications, curating the rules, and driving scalable testing standards that are considered open book and open source, if you would. We want to stay away from proprietary testing and fixtures because it needs to be. These need to be standards and specifications and testing processes that can be replicated by larger manufacturers that can afford the fixtures and do their testing. So I respect the research project. I can't wait to have a team-on-team discussion with them to understand what the output and conclusions were. I wholly agree, as we talked about before, that evolving our testing protocols and standards related to energy off the paddle face is an important next step. That said, no apologies on not having done it yet. It's really only become something important recently. We've been, all over advancing the ball in other areas around, like I say, coefficient of friction, upgrading our approaches to surface roughness, updating our approach to measuring ball performance with the compression test, those type of things that we've just done the last 3 years. And in fact, a lead engineer on that team, I had a conversation with. They provided us a damaged panel that we could use for our ultrasonic testing. I had a good conversation with him, and he felt that what we were doing, we were way ahead of the curve relative to where other sports were at this point in their life cycle. And a good analogy here is, if it's before your time, but the introduction of spaghetti strings in tennis, it was in the early 70s, but it wasn't banned by the ITF until 78. And so I believe our responsiveness here in terms of addressing rapid changes in the industry, new materials, new configurations and technologies, I believe that we're keeping pace, if not actually trying to keep ahead of it, with the advent of some of these testing protocols. So the next logical one is coefficient of restitution, and we'll figure out how to do that. I'd look forward to a conversation with PPL, and of course MLP, who has basically brought them in. And so, we do have follow-up conversations planned with MLP leadership in that area.
Yeah, I hope it works out, because I think pickleball in the last, year and a half, maybe 2 years, has definitely suffered from various fragmentation. Obviously, the PPA has their own rules that apply to pros that don't necessarily follow USAP. And then, I just think another body that is almost handling approval or denying of a process could just be even more confusing in the market if, let's say, they decide some of the current legal paddles should not be in play, but USAP does, and then amateurs are looking at pros like, why don't they use the paddle that I can use? Like, I hope we don't have that, just because there's already so much confusion, and we don't need more of it.
Yeah. Well, this is a research lab. They've got very credible talent within the lab, but they're not a governing body. Our responsibilities are fairly wide. Again, it does include advancing the ball on understanding the physics of the sport and being able to measure those attributes, create standards and testing protocols that support that. I think they're a very smart group, and we'd like at least to have a conversation with them to understand the outcome of their tests, their recommendations as well. But you're right, we don't. This isn't a governing body discussion, frankly. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the detail behind the results, and I think the understanding of that will should benefit everybody.
For sure. Well, the last thing I have that I just thought of real quick, if you're allowed to speak on it, I know at Newport it sounded like there were a number of paddles that did fail and were retired. Are you allowed to tell us what the things that failed on those paddles were?
Yeah,
not whose, but just like was
sure.
it deflection or yeah?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, we weren't testing for deflection. We were testing for
disbonding. Sorry,
disbonding, decomposition, essentially within the paddle.
Yep.
None failed surface roughness. And there were six, maybe 7 paddles that did fail the delamination category of issues, and so. Those paddles, and in most cases, the player just they either didn't get a sticker, right?
Yep.
Because it was the first time they submitted it. Another player had his tested frequently, and at a certain point, he was no longer comfortable with the survival of the challenge, and so he retired his paddle as well. And so I think the testing process was solid. Again, it was based on a known industry. It wasn't a science project. It was a validated, mature technology. But we'll probably evolve it just a little bit, add a little bit of granularity to the rating of where a paddle falls during the test. It's green, yellow, orange, or red. And so,
well, I heard you were giving out some warnings at the tournament, like, "Hey, this is close." Can you tell us like how you can kind of tell it's close? I'm sure without a visual image and seeing the tool, it may be difficult, but clearly you can tell like, hey, within a game or two, this paddle might not pass again.
I can describe it. And there's an XY field, like an oscilloscope on the instrument that we're using. And if a paddle's new, generally the signal will have a very tight pattern. And so as you move this probe around on the paddle, it'll generate a signal which ideally is very tight. It means relative to the known good test down in the throat area or toward the throat. As you move through the paddle, this point will start to move around. If there's damage, it will start to move around in this XY coordinates. And if it changes phase, if it goes from mostly in this pattern to adding another direction in the pattern, or if it scatters into a cloud, then there's an issue. If it's close, if it's very close to the edges of the bounding edges of the scope, then that's when we would issue the warning. You may be within a couple games of illegal. If it exceeds that XY coordinate, then that's a red, and we would pull the paddle.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for clarifying, because
I think we'll try
there are a lot of people wondering.
Yeah, we'll provide that, and we have been providing that feedback to the players. We did last weekend, and we'll continue to do so this upcoming weekend.
Yeah, I think that's wise, because I think you can. I have gotten to a point now where I have hit so many of these, we'll call them delaminated paddles for now, because that's what we're all used to. But I have gotten to a point now where I can tell when someone is playing against me within a couple shots, even if it was previously fine. My brother has been testing a paddle for me, and it's been great. I was playing with him yesterday, and I was like, dude, that is coming a little quicker than I'm used to with you. I was like, is it broken? And he actually said, no, it's not broken. I was like, there's no way. I was like, give me the paddle. So I started pressing into it, and it started. I could hear the core, and he was like, yeah, I just wanted to see if you could actually tell.
Right.
Basically, he lied to me to see if I could tell. But I think people know, but issuing that warning is very good for people who may be less gear inclined.
Right. And I think for people like you two that, and those of us that are in the industry, we've seen millions of shots hit.
Yeah.
And so you know what the results of a traditional paddle and a player's specific stroke mechanics, how much heat's going to come off the paddle face, and you see that, and generally speaking, you can see that there's something a little bit hotter about this paddle. And obviously the auditory clue as well, if there's a lower thunk or a higher pitch click as well, is a good trigger to look at as well. So I'm glad, though, that we're not depending on our senses
Yes.
From a testing standpoint, we're using, like I said, a mature aerospace technology, which is used for testing fuselage bonding and composite bonding in the aerospace industry. So we're very comfortable with using that today to determine something that might basically disrupt the rigidity of the beam that a paddle represents.
For sure. Well, I guess if you have any other, just final statements you want to leave people with, if you have anything upcoming or things that people may be interested in knowing about what's going on, now would be the time.
Sure.
But I think both of us, that's all our questions.
Okay. Yeah, we've got a lot that we're working on. As I've disclosed, we're looking at ways of introducing coefficient of restitution. We're making a migration to a very sophisticated optical scanning platform, which I'd love to share with you once we have it up and running in our labs. We're introducing an acoustic profiling. I don't want to call it a test, but it's we're looking for that profile of a paddle, and we will log this data. We're also looking at improving the approach which is used to understand the soundscape around facilities, which has been a big challenge for us. Even professional, acoustic engineering firms are using some pretty old school approaches to defining the soundscape, either before a venue is put together or after one's put together, and they're trying to address complaints. And they're using a very simplified. It might be lab calibrated, but it's a single omnidirectional mic. What we've been working toward is using this is a NASA-based study using auditory localization. And so this is a 19 capsule, it's called an ambisonic mic, which we would use to help understand the soundscape around a complex with much more granularity. And so we can attribute, that's the pickleball complex contributing this much sound pressure or this frequency to the soundscape. That's aircraft flyover. This is traffic. This is reflections of the pickleball facility off of the buildings behind us, which, in theory, the pickleball facility should not be paying the price for when it comes to the overall assessment. So we're looking.
So when you say facilities, does that include outdoor parks, or are you specifically talking about indoor facilities?
Actually, outdoor. Indoor, if you walk into an indoor facility, you've basically signed up to receive whatever noise.
Sure.
Clearly making that lower impact with baffling and dampening is a good idea for the health of the players or the experience of the club members. But outdoors, that's where we're trying to address this because there's unfortunately a lot of negative media related to this. It's disproportionate to the number of facilities that are out there. We'd say less than 1%, probably closer to 0.5% of all 11, 12,000 facilities that are out there are experiencing this issue. However, the media is giving it quite a bit of attention, and I believe it's disproportionate. And so we're doing our best to address it through a program targeted manufacturers to make quieter equipment, but we're also trying to work with the acoustic engineering community so that they've got the right tools to more accurately define the soundscape around a potential or existing pickleball facility.
Well, that's great. I think, obviously we've all been very focused on paddles, but I think that's, another factor, if not a bigger factor of pickleball's growth is going to be fixing that sound issue. As
Correct.
Much as people want to pretend, pickleball is not that loud or it's not that noisy, I think in general it is quite loud. And if you're in the wrong spot, it can really, we've seen it ruffle the wrong feathers.
Right. I think there's an aspect to this. I mean, the study of acoustics is a physical science, but how each of us interpret it, it's called psychoacoustics. And that's very important to understand. There's a small percentage of the population that have an issue with this frequency of something higher than 1,000 hertz. It's not unlike color blindness. There's about 8% of the male population that are colorblind and can't interpret.
Like Chris.
Yeah.
That's me.
They can't. I can tell by your background. They can't interpret light waves the same way that the rest of us do, and it's the same with acoustics. And so we have to respect that and understand it when we go in to try to solve the problem.
That's great.
Chip.
Well, we really appreciate your time. We appreciate you coming on and answering some of these questions. I look forward to seeing what you guys continue to do. And, I will say I'm glad I am not in the position to be dealing with some of this, but you guys seem, as far as the on-site testing, as far as the on-site testing goes, it seems like you guys are doing a great job, and I look forward to seeing more of it. I think the biggest thing everyone hopes for more of in the future, and we'll see how it handles, is just more either stuff like this or statements that just kind of help people know. But I think just knowing that people can contact you is good. I will certainly use you as more of a resource moving forward for when I make statements, and I hope other manufacturers or people who are interested in this understand that they can come to you and do that, because I think even prior to us talking, the last few weeks, I definitely didn't know that was even an option. So I hope this helps bring more awareness to that.
Yeah, just thanking you for the opportunity, Chris, to do this. I think it's important that we do help the market understand what we're working on. We do our best through outlets like Pickleball Magazine, our newsletters, our digital platforms. There are certain things that we do want to proactively discuss, and some things that really aren't appropriate. The expectation might be that we're going to send out a press release about delaminating paddles. Probably not.
Sure.
The manufacturers have to improve their QC processes, and so we leave that to them. I do understand your point, though, about the market concerns over the potential decertification of a paddle, and I think our process is actually pretty thorough in terms of what steps we take to ensure that ideally we don't have to do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Well, thanks again, Carl. We appreciate having you, and have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Will.